With a really good overview of HTTP and how that protocol helps us send and receive resources across the internet, we're now going to talk about the very specific methods that we can use over HTTP to perform specific actions on a server, a web application, or a web API. And we can send these requests from a client to the server in order to have certain actions fulfilled by the server or by the web application running on the server or the web API. To do that, we're going to go ahead and diagram out how this works so that we really understand what these particular methods help us accomplish as our clients request the web application or web API to perform work for them. So we're going to go ahead and start off with our client. On this side of our network request, we are going to have our client. And then on the other side of the network request, we are going to have our web application or our web API. And in this context, we're designing the web application or web API using Express. So we're going to go ahead and note that. We've got an Express, and we're going to do a web app or a web API. One of the two would be over here. And then on this side, we would have a client. And in this context, it's most likely going to be a single page application developed in React. So we're going to call it a React single page application or React SPA. And of course, that lives inside of the browser on the user's computer or on their mobile phone. And it is going to be making the requests across the internet over the HTTP protocol to the web server or web API. So we're just going to go ahead and call this a server just to keep things nice and clean so I don't have to keep saying web API or web app. And we're going to go ahead and call this one over here the client so that I can just use those short little terms. So we're going to say client right here. This is our client. And of course over here, this is our server. And this of course just strengthens the idea that we are working in a client-server pattern or client-server architecture. Now, the most basic of the HTTP methods that we actually use every single day, we make these requests all the time whenever we are on the internet. And that is because primarily when we are on the internet, we are requesting resources to come to us from a web server because we are usually digesting huge amounts of just information. And with that information, most of the time, we're pulling it from somewhere. We're not creating it. So right here, we're going to talk about the first HTTP method that we get through the HTTP protocol. And that is going to be the GET method. And now the GET method, as I was alluding to, it allows us to request a resource and pull that resource across the internet back to our application. And so in a GET request, usually we are calling for some sort of resource such as a HTML page. So maybe it's products.html. And so when we say GET, and then we say get us the products, let's see if we can put that in there. Get us the products page from the root of the website. That's what the slash stands for, is the root of the website or the web application that we're going for. When we do this request, what happens is that request will flow across the internet to the web server that's responsible for handling that request. That web server will then do all of the work that it does. Maybe it's building this products page dynamically by pulling information from a database and then plugging all of the products into this page, generating all the HTML for each of the individual products that are in the list of products, and then plugging those into an HTML template. And then it will take that resource. So let's go ahead and show that as a resource that we are getting back. And that resource would be the products HTML page. Let's go ahead and note that right here. Products.html. And that is the page that just got compiled by the server. And so in the form of a response coming back from the server, we're going to have that dynamically generated HTML page that now has all of the products in it. And that is going to be a response back to our client with that data that we requested. And so this, of course, is called a request in the orange. And then our yellow are going to be responses. In HTTP, it's called a request and a response. So maybe we should go ahead and denote those. So in orange, we've got ourselves our requests. Let me go ahead and undo that. So a line like this represents a request. We'll go ahead and annotate that. So this is a request in HTTP terminology. So that represents a request. And then anything that is in yellow, and it's usually going back this way from the server, is going to be a response in HTTP terminology. So response. And later on, we'll break down the request and response when we start developing inside of Express. But right now, it's just good to know an HTTP request comes from the client, and then a response comes from the server. And that's usually the pattern that we follow. Now, GET, when we send a GET request, we really just need to provide the path in the URL for the resource that we're asking for. Now, GETs aren't just used for HTML. If you remember to the previous video, we can also pull images, JSON files, XML files. We can pull all kinds of stuff using a GET. The important part is to understand that GET, we're not really pushing any data to the server. We are simply requesting the server to return information to us. And that could be a products.html. It could also be a products.json if we're just requesting data and not a full HTML page. And that would be if we are talking to a web API. So web app would return HTML most of the time, and an API would return JSON. No matter what, though, the request would be coming using a GET. The next method that we have that we can use is going to be the put request. So put. Now put, that method right there is primarily used for sending data from a client to the server, but is usually data that needs to be updated. In other words, it's data that already exists on the server side, and the client just did something to update it. So if we were to do an example, we would probably have put and then slash, let's say, password. Password dot. Let's do password reset to really make this clear. Oops. It's kind of hard to figure out where I'm at. There we go. Password reset. That'll kind of help because the password already exists, right? We already have a user account over here on the server. And we, through a request, have now just said, hey, server, will you please go ahead and update my password? So think of a put as an update request from a client to a server. Another example besides just a password reset would be if we are logged in as the admin over here and maybe we are updating a product's information or details. Maybe we're updating the description of that product. We would put a new product description. We would send that data across HTTP to the web server. And the web server would then, of course, update that data in a database. So maybe there's a database backend right here. And here we're doing a put and then password reset. So it's going to expect data to be pushed from this client to the server, which means that the data flow, if we want to look at that, is going to be, oops, let's choose a different, it would be right here. We would have a password piece of data that would be flowing with this request over to the server. And so this would be the new password. And that would be the data that is coming across with that put. With a get, remember the data is coming from the server. With a put, the data is coming from the client to the server. The server will do its work, and then it would send an informational response that says password successfully updated or failed. And so we would still see a response coming back from the server from that particular request, and it would come from the server to the client, and it would have just a message in it. So let's denote messages with a, let's just use maybe white here. I'll just say the message is going to be, gotta make sure I select my text tool. The message is going to be password updated. Oops, it went back to all black because I deleted everything. Let's start over. Let's go to our text tool, white, and then let's say password updated. And so that's going to be a message that is coming back as a response to this put. All right. So hopefully that makes sense. We are updating data that already exists on the server by using a put. Now, what happens if we want to actually submit data to the server that doesn't exist yet? Most of the time, we are going to be using a post. A post method of HTTP is what we're going to be using. And we will, just like these, be posting to a particular URL, but perhaps maybe it is a, and just to keep things clear, maybe it's a create product.html page. And that product right here, this page, maybe it handles updating the particular, creating a particular product over here. Now, a lot of times when we start creating APIs and stuff, we're not going to have .html here. I'm just kind of keeping it what you're used to seeing in a browser. But a lot of times, especially when you're connecting to an API to do this, which is what I'm going to start showing you right now, instead of it being a .html, it's going to be an API endpoint, which isn't really an HTML document. It is a path on our server, but it's a path to an action that does something for us. And you'll start to understand that better when we start building stuff in Express. But I'm kind of trying to take you from what you're used to seeing, which is password reset.html, and move you more into what it's going to be like when we are calling an API and we are calling an action rather than an actual resource on the other end. So we're going to have this post, which is sending information to this action on the server. And this action is responsible for accomplishing or doing something. And again, it's going to be an HTTP request, but just like before, it is going to have data in it. So it's going to have this bundle of data, which is in the body of our HTTP post request. And in it, it is simply going to have the new product data. So that's going to be like its description, its name, its price, all that kind of stuff. That is all going to be data, a little data document, most likely in JSON, that is going to be pushed with this particular request in the body of it, and it's going to be sent to the web server. Then the web server, of course, is going to take all this new data. It's going to do some work on it, maybe validate it, make sure that all the required fields are there. And then it's going to push that data and record it into a database sitting back here behind the application. Then, just like before, it is going to send a response back to the client, letting it know whether or not the product was saved. And it can be as simple as a message being sent back here that just says product saved. And it may also, depending upon how you implement your API, it may also be sending back a document full of JSON data right here. And it could be the product itself, or it could just be the new product ID. So the ID of the new product. So let's go ahead and just put this in here. New product. Oh, every time I delete, it decides to undo the color I had selected, which is really weird. New product ID. So we've got ourselves a new product ID right here, and it is of course being passed back to the client so that it now has the ID of the new product that was stored in the database. So there's get for pulling information, put for updating information that already exists on the server, and then we have post for creating new data on the server that doesn't already exist. The last one we're going to talk about in this video, the last method that we're going to talk about, is going to be the delete method. So get, put, post, and delete. So the delete method, it is most commonly used to delete existing data on the server, which is kind of what its name implies. And now that we're more talking about how APIs would take these requests with a ability or a function or an action instead of an actual HTML document or resource, we're going to go ahead and also talk about delete. So in delete, let's say, just to keep the descriptions really good, delete product, we would pass back an ID here. So maybe it's product 1235. So product 1235 is the product that we are trying to delete. Now, because we don't need to send a lot of data over to delete something, because that product already lives over here and we just simply want to get rid of it, what we're going to do is just pass the ID, and that ID is going to be passed to the server. The server is going to grab the ID out of the path for this action, so 1235. It's going to grab that ID, it's going to go to the database, and then it will make a request to delete that product from the database based on its unique ID. And you guys will understand more of this as we start to implement an API using Express. But it should come across pretty easy that we are calling an action or an endpoint in our API over here. We are passing a very specific ID, and this action knows how to pull this ID out of the URL path. And then it is going to call the database to delete any object that has this particular ID, which hopefully you've implemented right, and it deletes only one item. And then, just like with these other ones, the server is then going to send back an HTTP response back to the client, and it is going to most likely just send a message. And that message is simply going to say, product deleted successfully or something like that. All right. So we have our get, put, post, and delete. Now, for future reference, when we start building APIs using Express and we start building RESTful APIs, you're going to hear the term CRUD. And that is going to be a common term that you'll be hearing all over the place. And really what it is CRUD stands for create. The R in CRUD stands for read. And then U stands for update. And then the D stands for delete. So create, read, update, and delete. Now, all of these particular actions really just correspond to the HTTP methods that we just learned, which we can kind of put right here as a corresponding list. And we have get, which really corresponds to read. In other words, we're getting some information because we would like to read it or use it. Put really stands for update. And then post stands for create, and delete, of course, stands for what it means, delete. So here you can see the corresponding CRUD terminology that we use when we're building web apps and web APIs how that corresponds to our HTTP methods right here. So create, of course, maps to, let's go ahead and do a little mapping here since they're in different orders. Create maps to post, read maps to get, update maps to put, and delete maps to delete. All right, we're going to go ahead and end this video here because we've got a lot of information, we've got a lot of good understanding of the HTTP methods and how we use them to ask from the client's perspective, how clients can use HTTP methods to request actions to be done on the server. And then it is the server's responsibility to respond to those requests for actions to happen with some sort of a response based on what was sent to the server. And a lot of times it's just focusing on creating, reading, updating, and deleting resources that we have over on the server.